Hello and welcome to WTF Is Edge config. As you can see in this blog post, the edge config by Vercel is ultra low latency data at the edge. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Just kidding. In this video I'll be showing you how to use edge config in your application and how to introduce type safety, which you do not get out of the box unfortunately. Before we actually start, let me show you what edge config actually is. Over here in my Vercel dashboard, I've already created a config store. Down here you can see that I've populated my store with some JSON. Edge config is basically just a JSON store that is replicated globally using the Edge network. The best use cases for it are either feature flags, parameters for A/B tests, or dynamic configurations such as rewrites for middleware. For this video, I have scaffolded a default Next13 template application already. We will be connecting it to my Edge store and implementing a feature flag, toggling the instructions in the top left on and off. So let's head over to my IDE. This is my home page. It is a React server component that we will be adjusting slightly. First, we have to connect it to the Edge store. For that, Vercel has released a Edge config SDK for TypeScript. For that, we can just declare a variable, let's say config, and call the getAll function that is exported by said SDK. This function will return the entire contents of our store. If I head back over to my browser, we can check that right now I only have a single property called showInstructions, which is currently set to true. Let's now conditionally render the text in the top left using that variable. Going back to our editor, I can wrap the paragraph over here and add the condition to render this element. So config.showInstructions equals true. So let's start the dev server and head back to our browser. In our application, I can now refresh the page, and as expected, the text is still visible. Next, I'll head to the store and toggle the variable from true to false and save it. It will take approximately 10 seconds to replicate globally, and once that's done, we can go back to our application and refresh the page. Ignoring the fact that the logo now shifted to the left, our text is no longer visible. And this is a fairly simple way to introduce feature flags to your application. You don't need another third-party service, you don't need to pay anything for that, you just have your globally replicated store, you save your variables and just fetch them in your application. Unfortunately, there is one very big caveat to all of this. Once I return back to my editor and hover over the config variable, we'll see that it is of type any. True fans of TypeScript really dislike the any type. We want to have type safety. We want to know which variables are available. The getAll function, however, is generic. It allows us to specify the expected return type from our store. This means if we head over here and start writing the generic type, so show instructions as Boolean, we can see two changes. First, config down here is underlined because it is possibly undefined. This is the case when getAll fails to connect to your store. In that case, it will automatically return undefined instead of throwing an error. The easiest way to deal with this is using optional chaining. So adding a question mark over here and only accessing its properties if we are sure it's not undefined. Additionally, if we remove this and try to access the properties, we can now see that our feature flag is being suggested in the code completion. Unfortunately, this isn't sufficient for reliable type safety. You can run into different issues, for example access variables or missing variables. Check this out. If I go into my config store once again, and I just rename the variable from showInstructions to showInstructions2 and save it, I can now go back to my editor, set a breakpoint here before rendering the entire component, then I can head to my application, refresh, and now I can see that we have showInstructions2 inside of our config object, even though we kind of expected only to have showInstructions. So keep in mind, TypeScript types don't affect the runtime. They are only a construct used during compile time. So at this point, it would be really nice if we can have some runtime checks whether the data from the config store is actually what we expect it to be. Luckily, we can leverage a very popular runtime validation library for it. So first, let's stop this debugging over here and close the debugging window down here and open up a new file I've already prepared. In here, I want to export a new function called fetchConfig that is responsible for fetching the edge config, validating it, and then returning it. So let's start very simple with const config equals await get all once again, and just return the result directly without doing anything. In order to introduce runtime type checks, we can use the library called Zod. Zod works with so-called schemas. It wants us to declare the types that we expect, and then it will be able to parse a specific object and then tell us whether it was valid or not. So let's create a config schema variable, which will describe the shape of our store. So let's start by importing Zod, often abbreviated with Z. Our root level object will be an object. It will contain a single Boolean variable called show instructions, and it will be a Boolean. Next, we can take the returned config object of the getAll function and plug it into our config schema. So down here we say config schema.parse on the config object. If you pay close attention to the return type of fetchConfig, you will see that it returns a promise that includes an object containing show instructions, which is a Boolean. My claim at this point is that no matter what we get back, if we run it through the config schema, Zod will clean it up and we'll have runtime type safety. So let's go back to our page, and instead of calling getAll over here, we just call fetchConfig and auto import my edge config TS. You might have already noticed that show instructions is now highlighted as a Boolean, and I can save this file now. Once I go back to the browser, I will be greeted with an error. This error is Zod specific. It tells us that show instructions was required. Unfortunately, show instructions doesn't exist here. This is all nice and fine that we now know that something that we expected to be there is not there. However, it would be nice if we have a graceful way of supplying default values to it, which is very useful if somebody makes a typo here and the application still works with some basic fallback values. And what's really cool about this is the following. If we head to our Zod schema in our edge config file, we can say that this is not only a Boolean, but it also has a default value. Say it has the default value true. So no matter if we have a typo or not, we can be assured that we always have this Boolean value and that it will be by default true and overridden by anything that is online in our store if there is a definition for it. When I now go back to the browser, we can see that the application is once again running without an error and showing us that the instructions are still visible. Toggling the flag in our store to false, or rather in this case, fixing our typo and saving it, will help us to disable the instructions block here when I now refresh the page. Another thing about Zod that is really cool is that it can remove excess properties that you did not expect to have in the first place. So if I add a property that we do not care about in here, so let's say foo with 1, 2, 3 and save it, I can go back to my editor. Once again, I can create a breakpoint, head to my browser, refresh the page, and check the contents of our config object, and we can see that it only includes show instructions. It doesn't include the excess foo property. And before I end this video, I have one final suggestion to improve the config store that we're currently using. First, let's clean up the debugger, head over to the config store, and make the following adjustments. I usually like to separate my feature flags based on environment, typically development, which is often local, and production. And if you host your application on Vercel, you can also do the same with preview environments. To keep it simple, I'll just have 2 environments. For that, let's create 2 new properties. First of all, development and production. Then let's move our show instructions property into development and production. And now let's say we show the instructions during development, but not during production, and save this. In order to pick the correct configuration depending on your environment, there is only one small thing we have to change in our code. So let's head back to our code in our edge config file. And instead of calling getAll from the edge config package, we can just call get and specify a key to fetch from the Edge config store. So check first which environment we're running in. So whether we are running in, say, production. If so, we return the production key. Otherwise, let's say we return the development key. And as you can see, this is all that is necessary to fetch your respective config from the store, to validate it using Zot, and even supply some default values in case something has gone wrong at some point. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, take care.